Hey, college students. The future of our democracy urgently depends on us. You can help on-air student leaders curate trusted information on governance and elections and provide an online town square where we can all talk with politicians and each other to find common ground on issues and legislation on us.onair.cc. Our sponsors tonight are Democracy on Air, a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports the U.S. On Air network of 50 governance and election hubs, and GMU Students on Air, which oversees the GMU On Air chapter and the U.S. On Air network.
Good evening. My name is Ben Murphy, and I will be your host for today's Aircast with Karina Lipsman. To start off our Aircast, we produced a 1-minute video on candidate Lipsman's biography and her policy positions on issues based on her campaign website. Here it is.
Students on Air at GMU introduce Karina Lipsman. Karina Lipsman is the Republican candidate for Virginia's 8th congressional district. As a child, Karina Lipsman fled Ukraine with her single mother. She would later go on to attend Towson University for her undergraduate studies and Johns Hopkins University for graduate school. From there, she spent 14 years in the defense and intelligence communities. She decided to resign from those communities to pursue public office in her own congressional district. Lipsman's policy positions include getting inflation under control, limiting tax hikes, making the education system more transparent, modernizing the immigration system, and strengthening and improving law enforcement. Lipsman says, Virginia's 8th district needs someone willing to collaborate, work across the aisle with a new vision for the future, and work to change the toxic climate that has become so common. Go to va.onair.cc to learn more about Karina Lipsman, us.onair.cc to sign up your candidates, to learn more about the most competitive congressional and governor races, and to get the latest information on U.S. politics and governance.
Welcome, candidate Lipsman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben.
So to start off here, we were discussing a little bit before the Aircast about how one of the missions of our organization really is just the general promotion of democracy, particularly for college-age voters, but really the public in general. So the first thing we wanted to ask was, how do you think the public can become more engaged and impact our democracy?
That's a great question. So as someone who's grown up in an oppressive regime in Odessa, Ukraine, when it was still under the Soviet Union, America is truly the greatest country in the world. And we're probably the freest country in the world in terms of how do we engage, whether we engage in general. And so we have an amazing, amazing democracy here that allows us to be able to speak up, speak out, engage in conversations, practice any religion, be part of society in whatever ways that we want to. And this is the greatest part about people coming to this country is it's the land of opportunities and for freedoms. And we should have that mentality as we talk about any subject so that people can feel free to express their views. They can feel free to speak up and feel safe without fear of being reprimanded or outcasted from society. But I will say that, personally, running on a Republican ticket, despite being extremely moderate, and despite the fact that I will never vote 100% with the party or any party, I have faced my own discrimination and suppression. I've had my signs stolen and vandalized. I've had hate speech, anti-immigration slurs and slogans. And actually, Congressman Byers' campaign has stood by and said absolutely nothing, and they refuse to call on their supporters to end this. And of course, I feel like I'm being targeted. But you know what? It's not the first time that this little Ukrainian girl has picked up and rolled up her sleeves and been able to fight the the establishment, as well as older men who always got in the way of me being able to move forward and achieve what I have been able to achieve so far in my life. So I'm not going to let that stop now. And I think, as a society, we should be more involved in our local politics, join local clubs, learn as much as you can from various resources so that it's not just coming from mainstream, so that you can make your own decisions and formulate your own decisions based on that versus having someone tell you how to think.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Just to kind of follow up there, when it comes to ways people can impact democracy, do you think that it's pretty vital for people, along with reading a variety of sources and learning through various means? Do you think it's important to get a variety of perspectives from different individuals to influence your own perspective? Do you think that is valuable?
Absolutely. I think that's part of, being able to come up with new ideas and innovative ways to tackle current problems. I surround myself with different kinds of people, different political views, different industries, different backgrounds, different upbringings. And I think that's really important because you constantly want to be learning. And I always say that I'm never the smartest person in the room. And if I am, I need to reassess my friend circle or the circle that I'm currently in, because you always want to learn more and you want to learn from different perspectives, because if you're so closed-minded, you'll never be able to move forward. You'll never be able to look at things in a way that helps society or helps you personally as well. So having multiple perspectives, whether you agree with them or not, still allows you to build your own experiences and build your own brand and build your own way of thinking, so that you can address the issues that are important to you, but also address the issues that are happening locally.
Thank you for that response. So the second question that we wanted to ask here, and this obviously has to do partially with your Ukrainian heritage, but we wanted to ask, is there anything about U.S. policy towards Ukraine that you think should change? And if so, what?
So as someone with a Ukrainian background, I was born there. I lived there for 8 years of my life. I've lived through real socialism, real oppression, to the point where I was told by my family when I would go outside and play with other kids not to say anything about our family, or if I got a new toy, not to show it off. So you can imagine how, as a child, you can you're scared to talk to anybody. And so you're automatically blocked off from society. And that's part of the indoctrination in the Soviet Union that we've experienced. So coming here to America, was very an eye-opening experience for me, because I've always been taught that, Americans are these evil people. Even in the school system, I remember a math problem where it was something along the lines of, you have 5 loaves of bread in your house, and 2 greedy Americans are coming into your house and are going to, take 1 piece of bread. How many do you have left? So like that indoctrination, even in the math problem, was something that I've experienced. So I came to America and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing country in the world. I can talk to people. I don't have to be afraid of suppressing, my views, or, talking to people about what's going on in my family. So all of that being said, right now we see what's happening with the power struggle, and, oppression is something that President Putin has used on his people in Russia, and made it his life goal to recreate the Soviet Union. And we've seen him do this in 2008 with Georgia. We see him do it again in 2014 with Crimea. And so we knew it was only a matter of time before he decided to tackle or take on other countries in the Eastern Bloc, and Ukraine being such a pivotal strategic country. It was kind of in sight already. And having spent the last 14 years in the defense and intelligence community, we had all of this information up front. I've briefed senior officials on path forward, how to even back in 2014 on how to deal with Putin and how to deal with this crisis that was just going to explode at some point, and we were currently living it. So my position from day one has been that the Biden administration should have done more because we had the intelligence, we had the capability, we had the time to react. We just chose not to. We chose to approach it from a diplomatic perspective versus approaching it from a more forceful perspective, which Putin respects strength, obviously, more so than diplomacy. And so what I suggested was to have severe sanctions in place prior to the invasion, so that Putin, we would tell Putin to take his troops and tanks off the Ukrainian borders, and only then would we lift the severe sanctions. That way it would have prevented him from invading. That way he didn't have to backtrack. Right now we're in a position where there's basically a full-on war that we're seeing. And I'm watching and listening to my family who's back in Ukraine suffering, being shelled. And it's absolutely devastating and heartbreaking. But look, we are where we are, and I support aid to Ukraine, humanitarian and defense aid. But at some point, we have problems here at home, and I truly believe that charity starts at home. So we should not just be writing blank checks to foreign countries. We should be holding, there should be some sort of accountability. There should be transparency before we started, before we start turning off the taxpayer funded stream to other countries. And, if NATO or if Ukraine joins NATO, we'll be forced into this conflict. So I don't support sending American sons and daughters to fight and die to protect another country in a war that Biden could have stopped if he was strategic and smart enough to listen to the people around him. And we've seen that also with the botched withdrawal in Afghanistan. And not only did the 13 service people die for no reason, also a lot of Afghan and Americans died on the ground. And that was very unfortunate.
Well, thank you for your perspective. At this point, we want to open up the floor to our student panelists here to ask some questions. Our first student panelist is Joe Kubicki. He is a government and international politics major at George Mason. Go ahead, Joe. Floor is yours.
Hi, candidate Lipsman. I wanted to ask you about something that is a growing problem that between the federal government and individual states, and it's the legalization or at least decriminalization of marijuana. It's something that's already happened in Virginia, and it kind of seems to be just heading in that direction, at least from my perspective, throughout the country. And so I was curious what your perspective is on either decriminalization or full legalization of marijuana.
That's great question, Joe. And I support both. I support legalization of marijuana, and I support decriminalization of marijuana. We've seen, a lot of people, especially in the immigrant minority communities, unfortunately go to jail because of perceived possession of marijuana. And their lives are ruined essentially, and they can't get back on track. And so now they're in prison instead of being back out in the system because of a perceived notion that they were, trying to sell marijuana. Also, the fact that, it's been legalized in many of the states around the country. It's just a matter of time before the federal government has to look at something like this and say, just like tobacco, just like alcohol, we could potentially tax these goods and make profits off of it. So why wouldn't that be a benefit to the federal government? As well as, going back to my, professional career, I've held some of the highest security clearances in the Department of Defense, as well as the intelligence community. And a prerequisite to that is, drug use, right? And if all of these states are legalizing marijuana, how many people are we going to be able to produce who have never smoked pot before, or who haven't, at least tried something? And that's going to stifle the recruitment process for some of these jobs that require security clearances. So ultimately, this is going to be a detriment to the country, not only from an employment perspective and economic perspective, but also kind of a societal thing. So I am very much pro legalization of marijuana and decriminalizing it.
And just a really quick follow-up, you kind of hinted at it. So it sounds like you're also in favor of some sort of, I don't know if retributive policy would be correct or not, but like, what would you say to people who had been imprisoned over offenses for marijuana?
So I'm not a legal person, but I would think that folks should be able to at least have a chance to go through a process by which the courts would determine whether or not the reason why they were in jail in the first place was just based on marijuana possession, or if it was something else. So I think it's a case-by-case basis as well.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question, Joe. We'll move on to our second student panelist, which is Devin Pieczynski. He's a global affairs major at George Mason. Floor is yours.
Thank you for joining us today, Karina Lipsman. My question is, I think, going to be pretty important for everybody in this Zoom who is a college student. Joe Biden recently forgave $10,000 in student loan. He received a lot of criticism for that. So I'm curious what your stance is on student loan forgiveness.
So that's a great question, Devin, and thank you for asking it. This is something that's near and dear to my heart, especially from an education perspective. I paid my way through college, and I have seen some of my colleagues who joined the military so that they can have a free education. So I look at this as almost a handout, like everything else, from the federal government. And I don't believe that the federal government should be involved in paying off student debts by taking money from the taxpayers who have paid for their own college or paid off their own student loans. I do think that there's a bigger issue here, that the federal government is too involved in our college education. And this is something that we should look into more in terms of how do you create more competitiveness among schools, that they would lower their cost of education. But then also there's a huge stigma around community colleges, trade schools, technical and vocational programs. And a four-year degree should not be a prerequisite for employment in this country. A lot of the trade schools teach entrepreneurship, and you can go into something like become an electrician or a plumber or a carpenter, etc., and still make a great living using your hands and making more things here in America. And something else that I truly believe in is the money should be following the student and not just going into the school system. And that allows both parents and teachers to have a greater perspective in terms of where their kids are going to thrive from a parent's standpoint, but from a teacher's standpoint, it allows them to seek other school opportunities where it's more competitive for them and allows them to make a higher cost or increase in wage, but then also teach where they want to teach. And then something else I'll leave you with, as someone who mentors students as part of my position on the Johns Hopkins Alumni Board, and someone who continuously pushes for innovation in the heavily bureaucratic US government system, I think it's okay for people to fail. And we've had this perspective of not failing, of failure being a massive setback, but that's something that allows us to learn quickly and adjust. It allows us to be more resourceful and innovative, and we gain so much experience from failures that coming back to teachers and students and parents all working together, and teachers teaching students how to think versus what to think. And right now we see that the education system is truly failing our country. You guys are, the next generation of what our country is going to look like. You're the leaders of our country. So having someone be admitted into universities based on the color of their skin or their background or socioeconomic education or status versus meritocracy, I think is only hurting our communities and the future. And the folks that are hurt the most end up being the minority and immigrant communities. And true equity is allowing all students to be able to reach their full potential. And that includes investing in our teachers, allowing parents to decide what's best for their child. And every child being different, has different needs and unique ways of learning. Success looks different. And so I did actually read something in the Wall Street Journal the other day about the average test scores. I think it was on the ACT for college admissions tests. It fell to the lowest levels it's been in more than 3 decades. So this is something that we should really be focusing on in terms of how we set up students for success and what that ultimately looks like in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question, Devin. Our next student will be Ani Prakash. He is also a global affairs major, and he is also at George Mason. The floor is yours, Ani.
Good afternoon, Karina Lipsman. Thank you so much for being here. So my question does pertain to education. I know in your candidate website you mentioned that education is the great equalizer that can lift people out of poverty. What is the problem that the Biden administration has overlooked consistently in terms of quality education? And what do you think the federal government should do to provide greater access to underprivileged and impoverished communities for quality education?
That's a great question, Ani. So like I said, I've gone through the Baltimore public school system, so I know what it's like to be in that environment. I've also put myself through college in 3 years while I was working full time, and then I have an advanced degree in engineering from Johns Hopkins University. Education is truly the bread and butter of America, and that's what separates us from a lot of other countries in the world. But again, I am not a huge fan of the federal government mandating anything. I think the states and the parents and the schools should all be working together. The federal dollars should be following the student. It should not just be going into the school system. We've seen with the COVID relief in the Fairfax County schools, they received, I believe it was $1 billion in COVID relief for schools. And 87% of that $1 billion has yet to be spent. So where did that money go? Who is that going to? And a lot of it is going to the administration, and it's going to trainings for teachers on things that are other than basic skills. And that's why our kids are not able to read and write at the appropriate grade levels. So we're graduating people from high school who can't even read at the high school level. They're reading at elementary school level. They can't do basic math. They don't really understand our history. And, our history is very diverse. There's bad, good, and ugly, but I think learning your history prevents you from making those same mistakes later on down the road. And then also financial literacy has been a huge thing in our school systems that has not been taught. And so you have, Devin, to your point on school student loans, right? You're setting up individuals for failure right off the bat because you're not teaching them financial literacy and how to manage their bank account and how to deal with your finances. If you and I default on our loans, something is going to be taken away from us, right? Or, if we don't pay our cars or mortgages or whatever, that's going to be taken away. Why aren't the same rules applying to schools or to Congress, right? So something that I think in terms of the federal government should only be providing the federal funding and have transparency into where that funding is going into. And again, I think it needs to go to following the student, not into the school system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Ani. Our final student panelist is Frida Cervantes. She is a global affairs major at George Mason. Floor is yours, Frida.
Hello, candidate Lipsman. How are you?
Good. How are you, Frida?
Well, thank you for asking. So I read on your campaign website that public safety is a top priority of yours, which includes strong support for law enforcement. So if elected, what is your plan for promoting life-enhancing and life-saving relations between the police and the communities that they serve?
Great question. Very important, especially as a single female living in Arlington. I have seen crime just rising over the last 2 years, more than it's been in the last 10 years that I've lived in Arlington. I'm also honored that I was endorsed by the Police Benevolent Association, which very rarely endorses challengers. They usually endorse the incumbent. But given the current policies from the administration, as well as Congressman Beyer, we've seen a huge defund the police movement that has hurt the recruitment of our police officers. And they're resigning in record numbers. And you can't blame them because they're not being respected. They're being told how to do their jobs. And of course, there's always going to be bad apples everywhere. There's going to be bad doctors. There's going to be, bad teachers. There's going to be, in any field, there's bad apples. But I think for the most part, the law enforcement officers go into this profession because they want to keep our communities safe, because they want to do the right thing. And as I've chatted and had those conversations with them, we talked about opportunities to improve training, especially when it comes to the minority communities or especially the disabled as well, because if you don't know if someone is having a bipolar episode or if they're actually resisting arrest, right? And how do you tell the difference between those two? So we want to build trust with law enforcement officers. And that comes through funding, that comes through support, and that comes through resources and tools that they can use on a regular basis to improve their effectiveness in the community. And I know, interestingly enough, I was at coffee with a cop the other day. And it was amazing to see how they purposely did it at an Ethiopian shop, and in a very Latino dense community. And so they had a lot of Latinos come out so they can meet the police officers and get to know them and know that they're safe to contact versus being afraid that, they'll take them to jail or, there will be some sort of repercussions. And I think, with this whole defund the police movement, we've actually seen the immigrant and minority communities suffering the most, because that's where the police officers were able to deter violence and deter crime from happening. So supporting them is definitely at the top of my priority list, and working alongside the community and the law enforcement officers to ensure that there's trust and there's respect is very important. Thank you, Frida.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you for your question, Frida, and thank you, Mason students, for your participation today. Do any of you have any final thoughts? Everybody good? Okay. Well, thank you, candidate Lipsman, for your participation. Do you have any final thoughts today?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. This was a great discussion. I really appreciate what you all are doing on campus to, create diversity, create an opportunity for a safe space to provide your perspectives and be able to have those hard conversations in a very civil and respectful manner. And, our biggest threats right now are not climate change, but a Russia who wants to take over the world, and a China who is eating our lunch when it comes to manufacturing. And I want to represent you in the halls of Congress. And I will never, ever, ever, ever vote along party lines 100%. I will vote 100% with the people. And that's something that my opponent, Congressman Beyer, cannot say because he's voted 100% with the party. And I think that's where you have polarizing politics, and that's where you create that polarization amongst people. So I look forward to working with both sides of the aisle, but most importantly, working with the people of Northern Virginia to create opportunity, prosperity, and a better tomorrow. And you can visit karinaforcongress.com to learn more. Thank you again.
Yeah, once again, thank you for joining us. That's all the time that we have for tonight's evening's Aircast. Thank you for our viewers and participants, and we hope you have a good evening.
You can learn more about the US On Air network by going to us.onair.cc and select one of the About posts. You can find a video recording of this Aircast in our US and Virginia On Air YouTube channels and in VA On Air posts.